Is everyone ready? 3, 2, 1, go. We're proud to affirm the resolution that the USFG should implement a cap-and-trade policy for greenhouse gas emissions. Just some brief definitions. Cap-and-trade is a system for controlling carbon emissions and other forms of atmospheric pollution. Basically, each company is issued a supply of quote-unquote supply of carbon that they can burn, and if they spend more than that, they can trade with other systems that require it. This has worked in many small places, but never been tried globally. So the plan text is pretty simple. We would implement a cap-and-trade system similar to the one in California. Basically, how that system works is designated per company. There's a total amount of carbon each company can produce. It's close to like 500 million tons in total, and then every year that goes down. So based on the company's size, they're assessed rations of carbon, how much carbon they can pollute, and they can barter and trade it. It's fine. Yeah, barter and trade it in the first place, they can sell it to each other. It basically worked in California, we'll get to this in our argument, but also the money that they get from the system because of all the trading and taxing that goes on carbon goes to fund greenhouse gas projects, so this be implemented normal ways and means. We believe this branch should be judged on utilitarianism. This is preferable for 3 ways. 1, utilitarianism is the only way to define degrees of wrongness. For example, if I break a promise to take someone take someone out to dinner is way better than breaking a promise to take one to hospital. Only utilitarianism can explain why the second one's wrong. Also, utilitarianism leads to the most fair division of ground because it allows everyone access to equal amounts of arguments to prove why it's good or why it's bad without any specification. So you should prefer util over any other framing that they might come up with.
Point of clarification?
Yes?
This is pretty much just the same as net benefits, right?
Yeah, net benefits, utilitarianism. It's just saying whoever does the greatest amount of good for the greatest amount of people should win this debate. Yes, simple. But we also believe the focus should be on preventing climate change because that's an existential threat to this country. Our first argument is about climate change. The uniqueness. Right now, we can see that climate change is an imminent threat. The A sub-point is the temperatures are rising by more than 2 degrees every year. But the B sub-point is every year billions of tons of carbon are polluted all around the world, which causes sea level to rise because it gets stuck in the atmosphere, which causes temperature rise and melting ice caps. The C sub-point is that scientists say the point of no return is 2025. Basically, what this says is once we reach that point of no return, there is no going back, where the effects of climate change are basically doomed. But the next argument is that you can see that the United States is a big polluter. I'll take it at the end if I have time. Specifically, the first argument is that 60% of global pollution comes from the United States. The B sub-point is that they emit more than 1 billion metric tons of CO2. But here's some interesting information. According to the Environmental Justice Agency, that there's a stark divide between who's producing this carbon. A lot of this carbon and greenhouse gas emissions are coming from big companies. For example, 400 companies accounted for close to 40% of emissions, which is a huge amount in the United States. But the next argument here is specifically the US has shown no interest in acting to fix climate change under Donald Trump. Specifically, Trump has, quote, said that it's not a threat. According to the EPA, they haven't done anything climate change related since Trump got elected. Finally, we can see that the Union of Concerned Scientists expressed serious concerns that the Environmental Protection Agency was actually sabotaging any effects to improve the climate. So how do we change this? The first argument is empirically proven that cap-and-trade lowers carbon emissions. We have 3 main examples. The first example is California, which saw drastic reductions of emissions by up to 20% each year by implementing this plan, because less carbon is available, forcing companies to produce less. The B point is Ontario. It's fine. Ontario saw a huge decrease in pollution because of this when they implemented this system at rates of up to 33%. Finally, China has recently implemented this system too, and they're seeing massive reductions specifically in certain areas that used to be super polluted. Now it's going less and less. The next argument is that companies are incentivized to reduce emissions. The first argument under this is that they have less to produce every year, so they have to adopt more clean practices. The problem is right now, companies aren't adopting those practices. By forcing them, we'd force them to transition to green practices. The next argument, they have to pay to buy carbon, and that money goes into a fund which is used for clean infrastructure projects, meaning that even if they're buying more carbon, that money goes into funds that does stuff that makes the environment improve. What?
They buy their allocation from the government.
They buy their allocation and trade it among things. The next argument is, according to the Environmental Defense Fund, this would be the most effective way to fight climate change by implementing a cap-and-trade policy. The next link argument, or what happens when we pass the plan, is signaling. Specifically, according to the California Environmental Foundation, if the United States adopted a cap-and-trade plan, it would show a shift in the United States climate change approach. Basically, what happens, we'd be shifting away from not caring about the environment to actually valuing the environment and caring about it, and showing that we actually care about trying to fix the harms of climate change. The next link argument is that the money spent would be spent fighting climate change. We go to disaster-proofing houses. So right now, a lot of houses are in the problem with sea level rise. So we make sure that people are safe. We'd also build good, greener infrastructure, encouraging people to drive electric cars, would produce less things. The money would go to do good things. Now the impacts. The first impact is greenhouse gas, right? Greenhouse gas causes the oceans to melt, which causes ice caps to melt, which causes ocean flooding to rise. We can look at the fact that the vast majority of this country, or close to like 40% of this world, lives on land that is less than 50 miles away from the ocean. It's estimated that by 2020, 2050, 750 million people would be displaced. I'm sorry, I got no, 750. 1 billion would be displaced according to World Bank. We can see that because of the rising sea level, this means that land that used to be inhabitable no longer be inhabitable because the sea level is rising and take it out. We can also see that this did directly harm poor people. Here's why. Poor people are more likely to live in areas that are harmed by climate change, so they have the least amount of money to move and relocate. So climate change distinctly harms poor people at worse rates, which means it's the most important impact that we have to fix too. Also, the greenhouse gases causes emissions to rise, I'll take it at the end of the time, which kills biodiversity, which will also lead to extinction. Our next argument is about the climate change externality, solving the market failure. The first argument is that a negative externality is defined as an economic market failure in which there's a cost suffered by a third party as a result of the transaction. For example, if I put up a really ugly statue in my yard, despite the fact that I'm paying for the good with the seller, other people suffer as a result of the transportation. People have to see it every day. One type of negative externality is a social cost, when the general public experiences a major negative consequence from the transition that they are not part of. The second argument is that fossil fuels emissions are defined as a negative externality. They're a social cost. That's because when companies emit fuel and fossil fuels, the general public, not just the companies, are affected by this and punishing them. So what happens? Emissions of fuels lead to short-term consequences of pollution, flooding, and agriculture, but in the long term, they will make huge parts of the world inevitable. The market failure is that there are more costs to emissions than prices that the company pays for the fuel. How does cap and trade fix this? By implementing cap and trade, we encourage less emissions. By limiting how much they can emit, we force them to pay for the cost they're doing. They're paying for their costs. Right now, they're getting a free ride. Basically, these companies are getting away with polluting and harming other people. So we force them to pay this cost. This makes market price reflect the cost, forcing companies to take into account other people's actions. So at the end of the day, it's clear that we need to do something to fix climate change. For the sake of our Earth, vote affirmative. Thank you.
So the order is just going to be some quick work on the definitions, and then 3 main arguments for the opposition side, and then I'll move on to refuting the government's case. 8 minutes. Judges ready? Everyone's ready? Yeah, great. 8-minute LOR, OOC, starting now. Starting off on the definitions debate, we largely agree with most of the definitions coming out of the government case, but specifically on the definition of greenhouse gas, they define it specifically as carbon dioxide emissions. While that does constitute a large portion of greenhouse gas emissions, that's not all of our greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gases not only include carbon dioxide, but they also include stuff like water vapor, methane, and sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, stuff like that. The fact of the matter is that even if you were to go and tax carbon dioxide, there is no reason whatsoever why these companies wouldn't reduce their emissions on those other types of greenhouse gases, which means that on that, they're really not solving for anything. You're just incentivizing companies to do it differently, not less.
Legal stop time for it. It's POI.
Oh, POI, sorry.
Yeah, thanks.
I'll just take your POI once I finish getting through the opposites. With that said, let's move on to framing debate. We largely agree with the framing debate. The side that best creates benefits in their world should be the one that actually wins the round. So, contention 1 of leader of the opposition case is going to be one that empirics simply don't work. According to a recent study by UC Berkeley, California cap and trade system that has been going on right now simply isn't working right now. If you have to look at the fact of the matter is that in 2018, there were actually increasing greenhouse gas emissions in 52% of all companies that are registered that are actually based in California. The fact of the matter is that when you have to look at the data, when you have to look at cited studies, the California cap and trade system simply doesn't work. All the empirics simply fall because they're not even citing a study at all in this case. We're actually citing someone from UC Berkeley. With that said, also within the study, it also says that pollution disproportionately affects the minorities and the poor who are around these industrial areas, which means that overall they're harming the poor, not helping them overall. Moreover, being going under this contention is the Foreign Affairs vote. Is that Foreign Affairs tells you that cap and trade systems have only empirically kind of worked within countries with large hydrothermal plants. The fact of the matter is that if you actually want to create a policy that really works, a cap and trade system that really works, the United States is not the proper place to go and do it because we largely rely upon fossil fuels. Meanwhile, in a few places where it has worked, they've already been using stuff like hydrothermal plants. But third and finally, the fact past cap and trade policies haven't worked within the United States for the sole reason that nobody knows exactly how much carbon dioxide is worth. For example, when Trump was voted into office, he literally literally revised the societal cost of a carbon dioxide ton of emissions from pretty much like $50 down to $1. The fact of the matter is that this shows you that these prices are extremely changeable, and we can't actually make a concrete policy off of this. It simply doesn't work. Moreover,
POC. What do you mean Trump changed the cost from $50 to $1 on
Oh yeah, so
what are you talking about?
a lot of our policies are based off of like how much damage is like carbon dioxide do to our environment, and Trump literally changed the numbers down from $50 per dollar. That's pretty much what our counter is. Contention 2 is going to be the issue that energy prices increase within the government world. Even if it is true that they decrease the overall amount of emissions coming out of factories and energy plants, they're always going to be increasing the overall prices of goods and services and energy throughout the entire nation. A point is that the Heritage Foundation finds that according to most cap and trade carbon dioxide emission proposals within the United States, there is going to be a 58% increase in gas prices and a 90% increase in the prices for electricity in most homes. This means two main impacts. First of all, that means that the household quality of life goes down. And second of all, this is always going to be hitting the poor the hardest, because regardless of how rich or poor you are, you always need gas for your car, you always need enough electricity to keep your house heated at night. Insofar as that's true, that means that the poor are always going to be hit the hardest, because the increase in prices, they have to go and absorb the most. Meanwhile, the middle class and the rich can use their excess cash to go and mitigate the risk. This means that overall, you're going to see more people freezing to death in the middle of the winter because they simply cannot afford the increased prices of electricity to the tune of 90%. The point under this contention too is, once again, the Heritage Foundation finds that if you implement most of the normal means proposals advocated for within the United States, you're going to see tens of thousands of jobs lost within states that are distinctly reliant on fossil fuels, such as in West Virginia or Wisconsin. This means three main impacts. First of all, it's going to be destroying the local economy. Insofar as you're destroying all these thousands of jobs, not only are you destroying their jobs, but you're also destroying the various other the spending they would actually put in the local communities. But second of all, it's a terrible quality of life for those tens of thousands of people who do lose their jobs, because overall, I'd say that you have a pretty bad, that you're not really feeling that great if you have if your job, you pretty much just got fired from your job. But third and finally, insofar as you're making all these many different businesses go out of business because they can no longer afford these higher energy prices, that means overall less revenue for the local government, because you can't get revenue from a company that no longer exists. Third and finally, the third contention under the opposition case is simply that the large companies that they say actually emit all these house emissions actually move elsewhere. Yes?
Yeah. What are your three contentions? Like, what are the taglines? Because I'm having trouble flowing it.
Sure. Contention 1 is that empirics don't work. Contention 2 is that energy prices go up. And contention 3 is that companies move elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, right. Time stops during cases.
Yeah, I know.
347 resuming. Now, contention 3 is that these companies simply move elsewhere. As the Council for Foreign Relations explains, the companies will simply either A, move overseas, or B, the companies that actually do stay within the United States are going to be hit by the cap and trade system the most, which means that the prices for the goods and services increase, which makes their competitiveness overseas even worse overall, because they're competing against companies in countries who don't have to go and follow the cap and trade system. This means that factories and other companies actually move overseas. They talk about how large companies are the ones emitting most of these greenhouse gas emissions, but they're the ones with the resources to actually move all their operations overseas. This means that a few main things. First of all, they're actually increasing the overall amount of emissions because they're moving towards developing countries with weaker regulations, like say China or Vietnam, that simply with weaker regulations that they no longer have to follow. And India, they're moving into these countries with weaker regulations. When that happens, they're going to be polluting more. They no longer have to follow any of these regulations whatsoever. You see an increase in pollution overall. This means, even more so, this impact is going to be continuing into the future, because when these companies start to go and develop well overseas, that creates a perverse incentives for companies within the United States who decide to go and stay. It creates an incentive for them to actually move overseas as well. Because why would you stay within the United States if all your companies who are competing with you within the United States are also making more money than you, because they can outcompete you because they don't have to follow a cap and trade system? All of this means that at best, the government is not solving for the problem of carbon dioxide emissions. At best, they do absolutely nothing to the level of emissions. And at worst, they overall increase them on the global stage overall. There's a reason why they call it global warming. It's because it is a global problem. Just the United States doing something will not work. Onto the governmental speech. First of all, on contention 1 of climate change, as an overview to the entire contention, most of the opposition's case already solves back for this. They keep on talking about how climate change is bad and about how we're really close to the brink. But the entirety of the opposition case tells you that they don't solve for climate change. At best, they neutralize emissions. At worst, they make emissions worse. With that said, they also talk about how 60% of the pollution comes from the United States, and that big companies are the ones who are actually emitting most of it. Cross-applying my analysis on the opposition case, Yeah, sure, these companies are large. They have the resources to move overseas. If anything, that's a reason for the opposition side. But second of all, we can actually turn this against them because the smaller companies who don't have the resources to move overseas, they will be drastically outcompeted because they don't even have the resources to run themselves, much less pay an extra tax added onto their higher energy prices. Next, they talk about how Ontario and California have worked so far. They give no evidence whatsoever. Meanwhile, we actually say a clear Berkeley study that shows you that cap and trade within California is simply not working. And then they talk about how China has a cap and trade system. If this was true, I would have heard about it on the news. The fact of the matter is that if China actually implemented such a sweeping environmental regulation, it would be all over the news. This is just blatantly wrong. Next, they talk about how they can just buy permits from the government. They can turn this against them because that's just another opportunity for political favors and corruption to go sweep through the government so that some companies can get sweetheart deals. Next. On the impact of global warming, that's probably going to be where they're trying to derive most of their offense in this round, but sorry, but the entire impact is just non-unique. Three main responses. First of all, cars emit a large amount of greenhouse emissions right now. Insofar as you're not taxing that and you're not putting a cap on that, you're still going to be causing so many emissions. But second of all, China and India and other developing countries are also going to be emitting as well. Insofar as that's true, that even if the United States were to go and reduce its own emissions, the emissions in those countries are still going up because they don't have to implement the policy. And finally, the permafrost is already melting. There's no unique reason as to why the brink is right now. So even if global warming is true, we've already passed the brink. And lastly, on contention of externalities, there's no terminalized impact on this argument, which means that you can just cleanly outweigh off the opposition case. And lastly, it's unclear where exactly the value of this. It's unclear where the value of the externality is, which means that there's no actual way to implement this into a policy. It's for these reasons I urge an opposition ballot.
Start out by talking about the externalities argument. I'm going to go on to the negation case, and then I'm going to finish off with our climate change definition. Okay. Okay. Start time now. Today we are proud to affirm the resolution that the United States federal government should implement a cap and trade policy for greenhouse gas emissions because doing so fixes the negative externality, the social cost, the market failure that is the core factor in driving climate change right now. Okay, the one thing that they say on our definitions, going over that quickly, is that it's not just climate change. Yeah, we agree, it's all the greenhouse gases, that's what's included in our plan. I just want to clarify one other thing. The way that it works, I think we messed this up a little bit in the first speech with cap and trade, is that the government allocates, they allocate the emission cap to each individual companies, and then they allow the companies to trade back and forth, and then they tax the trades, which is where they're getting the money. Okay, moving on to the market externalities point. So what we argue on side affirmation is that what's driving the climate change problem, what's driving companies to emit fossil fuels, is the fact that the prices that they pay to emit fossil fuels do not reflect the social cost, the negative externality, the market failure of what they are doing. When a company buys a fossil fuel, that just reflects the marginal cost that the other company that has, made the fossil fuel has needed to do in order to get that oil or whatever. However, the fact is there's much larger social costs to buying this fossil fuel, to emitting these fossil fuels. As Saltik told you in his first speech, I want to clarify this number, it's 143 million people will be displaced by 2050. There is clearly a much higher social cost, a much higher negative externality as a result of these emissions than what's currently reflected in the cost, because there's a third party who's suffering negative consequences. Right now, that's not reflected in the cost that companies are paying in order to get these fossil fuels. So the thing is, what side affirmation does is it attaches this cost there. We give companies an allocation of the amount of emissions that they can do, and if they want to do additional emissions, they have to buy allocation from other companies, which therefore attaches a social cost onto these fossil fuel emissions, which therefore makes companies face the fact that the price is actually the cost of their actions, which fixes the market, which makes the climate change issue a lot better. They only say that we have no impacts here, but this is simply the economic rationale for how we're solving the climate change problem. Okay, moving on to their arguments. Okay, first of all, they tell you that empirics don't work because in California it's not working, but look back to our UCLA study that said that we saw a holistic 20% decrease in emissions. Their statistic, it actually doesn't even work because they say that in some percentage of the companies there was an increase, but we give you a holistic statistic that says that emissions overall were lower by 20%. Okay. Anyway, we also have the logic here related to the fact that as they tell you themselves, the oil prices and things like that are going to be higher, so of course companies wouldn't be like emitting more. That is wrong both on an empirical level and on a logical one. Okay, they say the United States isn't the right place to do this. We don't have, we don't have reliance on renewables. Countries that have done it, they need to have reliance on renewables. Like they don't give you any examples of countries that have done it who have had reliance on renewables who have done so well. We give you the example of it working in California. Again, holistic 20% decrease in emissions. Also, we give you examples of Ontario. For example, they're like not particularly reliant on renewable energy either, and it was pretty effective there. In addition, we would say that the renewables industry in the United States is working really well. The problem is it's a little bit more expensive than fossil fuels right now. If we are able to adjust this cost of the fossil fuels as a result of cap and trade, we could potentially do really good things for the renewables industry. We could give it the spark that it needs, which is an additional positive impact on side government. Okay, they said Trump decreased the price of oil from $50 to $1. Like, what are they talking about there? Like, Trump can't do that? I mean, potentially they could clarify that in their next speech, but I was quite confused because it didn't make a lot of sense to me. Moving on, they say that oil prices are going to go up. So, okay, here's the thing, term. It's good if fossil fuel prices go up because right now they're too low. They don't reflect the social cost of what happens when you buy fossil fuels, then you emit them because tons of people are suffering. Again, 143 people will be displaced by 2050 as a result of climate change. The prices that we as companies and that we as individuals pay for fossil fuels need to reflect that. They can't just reflect the marginal cost of production that companies face. They need to reflect the negative things that are occurring to third parties. Otherwise, we have a market failure and we will see the system failing as it is now. This is why we are in the climate change crisis. In addition, okay, so they're talking about the poor. Potentially it could have some negative costs for the poor. I'm going to admit that. It's a trade-off. But here's the thing. Do we want to have negative costs for the poor when we can literally no longer emit because we've already ran out of these fossil fuels and things like that? Or do we want to have a transition now by choice? Yes, what does that say? Also, turn this again. The poor are harmed much more by climate change. As Sophic told you in his first speech, the poor are being displaced like no other. Indigenous people particularly are really affected by this. I'm thinking at the end of time, sorry. Anyway, indigenous people are particularly affected by this. The poor are more affected by climate change. While there might be some short-term negative impacts, we are promoting this transition now. It's good that these prices are increasing because it's reflecting the social cost. And the simple fact is climate change in the long run is going to have worse consequences for them. So at the bare minimum, we can solve those overarching consequences of mass displacement, people losing their houses, things like that. Okay, they say people are going to lose their jobs because of fossil fuel companies going out of business. Like, we think that to solve a world with climate change, we need to shift to renewables. So yeah, fossil fuel companies are going to need to go out of business to prevent our imminent doom. Like, yeah, I mean, just saying. Okay, now moving on to the argument of how businesses are going to go elsewhere. We did this in California. All the major tech companies, or sorry, not tech companies, like all of the companies that are here, are still here. They haven't cited one example of Ontario, California, or even potentially China, any companies leaving, so they're literally empirically wrong. Name one instance where one of the many cap and trade policies has been implemented all over the world and someone left. Never have, empirically wrong. The second logical counter here is that the United States is a really desirable place to have your company. Probably have a nice quality of life here. I mean, we have great food, great culture, lots of stuff. I mean, under Trump it's a little worse, but anyway, it's a pretty great place to have a business. We also have a lot less regulations on businesses and lower taxes and things like that than the EU does. So there's a lot of reasons why people want to live in the United States, both personal and in terms of literal business regulations. And given that they're empirically wrong, this clearly is true. Okay. Also, again, they talk about smaller companies. This just didn't happen in California. I mean, if they have someone that says that this happened in California, great, but they don't. And this is our empirical example to prove them wrong. Now let's go on to our climate change argument. They say that the op case solves. But how do they solve? Right now, they are advocating for the status quo, and in the status quo, we're seeing more emissions by year. The years from 2010 to 2019 were within that was 5 of the hottest years we've literally ever seen. It's crazy. As Sophic tells you in all of the statistics that he brings up in his speech, climate change is having super negative impacts for people all over the world, and we're seeing more emissions by the year. The key thing is this is cause. These emissions are caused as a result of this negative externality. Companies just are not facing the actual price that they need to be paying when they look at these costs. Okay, they say we don't solve, we just maybe neutralize or make it worse, but again, they're advocating for the world of the status quo. At least we are going to likely decrease these, as we saw in California, as we saw in Ontario, and as we saw in small parts of China. Moving on to the China thing. They said, if it happened in China, then we would have all heard about it. It happened in a few sections of China, as Sophic tells you in his first speech. It's not everywhere. It's a fairly small thing, but we didn't see any of the negative impacts they're talking about anyway. They say we have no evidence for California, but again, 20%, and also we cited, if Sophic didn't tell you, it was UCLA. 20% decrease in holistic emissions. We saw 33% in Ontario, extend those things. Let's see. Also flow through the point about how we encourage companies to adapt cleaner practices, and then also think about what I was saying earlier related to how we're probably going to be doing good things for the renewables industry, which is essential to solving climate change in the long run. They say buying from the government is bad, but again, sorry, as I clarified, they're not actually buying the permits from the government. The government's allocating them, and then they're going to be selling them to each other, and the government will be taxing the sales. Okay, they say it's non-unique because of like cars, but the thing is companies account for an enormous percentage of carbon emissions. We have to start somewhere in solving this, and given that, what was the number you gave us?
Like 60% is from like everyone else, so we're going after a lot of it.
Okay, it's a huge percentile of the emissions in the world that come from United States companies. It's a simple reality. We want to solve climate change, and this is where.
Also, they talk about like the ice thing melting, but say like we can help prevent that if we do it right now.
Yeah, we can prevent these things like the ice melting by simply decreasing the rate that these that the temperatures are increasing. So for all these reasons, I strongly affirm. Thank you.
The order is going to be on definitions first, then addressing the affirmative plan, and then going on to write down the LO, and then on to the prime minister's speech. Is everybody ready?
Sorry, order one more time?
Order is going to be definitions, plan flaw, and then LO. Yeah, lots of extensions and stuff like that. Great. Everyone good?
Okay, yeah, good.
Then 8 minutes begins. Now, to clarify the definitions, we just want to make sure that we're extending our definition of greenhouse gases across the flow. It is literally any gas that absorbs infrared radiation. That's going to be really important because this includes water vapor, and that's going to be important later in the speech. But next, let's go on to the affirmative plan. A couple clarifications here. First of all, they talk about how we're starting off with 500 million tons of carbon emissions per company per year. Remember that number. But next, they talk about how this...
There's no POC.
Oh,
Sorry,
never mind.
POI.
Sure.
Okay, are you aware that this is not what we said in your gross emissions? That was a total amount of carbon given out, and if we weren't giving per company, it would be distributed based on the size of the company. So it's not like 500 million tons per company. This is clearly in our first speech.
Okay. But then they talk about how this number would go down every year, but they never specify how much. At that point, if it goes down like by 1 ton a year, we're going to find that this number is vastly affected by our politics. And insofar as the affirmative is implementing this plan in the status quo, we're finding that the political climate, as they themselves state, is not conducive to this like decrease in carbon emissions. So what we're going to find is this 500 million is just going to keep perpetuating through the status quo, and they never provided a comparative analysis on how this 500 million relates to status quo emissions. We don't even know if this is an increase or a decrease in carbon emissions. But next, on the fact that that these companies can trade these permits. First of all, this is problematic because it means that big companies can just buy out all the permits of small companies, which like de-incentivizes competition. And if you're going to look at the economic model, that's going to be worse for the economics because when we don't have competition, every single one of the negative externality arguments relies on this fact that there is perfect or near perfect competition within the companies. But the moment you take away that perfect competition, you are essentially having a monopoly or an oligarchy. At that point, we're going to find more negative externalities in their world. Sure.
Why didn't this happen in California?
Okay, I'm going to get to the California argument in a while. But then lastly, on this idea that the money will go to fund reducing greenhouse gas project emissions, they cannot fiat this at all. There's nothing in the resolution that says that the money's going to go towards fighting greenhouse gases. In fact, I would say that we have to look at the resolution in the context of our current political climate. Insofar as my opponents themselves admit that the United States is and the Trump administration is super against hindering greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to find that this money may just go towards something like building a wall instead. They have no solvency for actually going towards solving greenhouse gas emissions. But now let's go on to the LO. First, as an overview on this whole California debate, because remember that the whole plan is based on the California and the way it was implemented there. There's two clashing studies, and let's compare them here. On the negative, we have a study from Berkeley that says that after we implement the plan in California, each California company's emissions increased by 50%. And then the affirmative comes up here and says that overall emissions decreased by 20%. The conclusion is pretty clear, and that's what the negative is saying, is that countries, or the companies rather, have left the country and gone to countries like India or China. That's why we see the overall emissions decreasing, yet the per company emissions increasing. At that point, we're finding that the studies are able to mutually exist, whereas the offense still close for the negative. But even if you don't buy that, California does not necessarily scale up to the entire United States, especially because most dirty energy companies don't exist in California. They're not going to be as hardly hit by these as other companies will, and they're going to be less incentivized to move outside of the United States. But that's really the only response they make to our first contention about the cap and trade not working. You can extend that theme across the flow. But then they talk about how on the rising energy prices, on the rising energy prices. They talk about how like Trump is not able to affect the price of oil and it doesn't make any sense. To clarify, we were just saying that he's changing the penalty on oil. Basically, Trump has the power to decide how much that bar is going to decrease every single year. At that point, what we're finding is, again, like I said before, insofar as the political climate is strongly against like hindering carbon emissions, we're going to find that it's very unlikely that Trump like significantly lowers his bar every single year. But next, let's go on to the actual offense on the second contention. There's a lot of problems with the affirmative responses. First of all, they admit that increasing the price of energy is good, and they even admit that having some concrete cost to the poor is a good thing. This is extremely problematic because it is not just like a matter of what is good or bad for the poor, but also it perpetuates this like vast inequity in our society. Insofar as the poor literally don't have the money to pay for heating in their homes, they're going to be like freezing to death in the winter. This is not only like terminal and existential for the poor, but also it's like a terrible precedent for our society and an immoral thing for the U.S. government to do. They're essentially ignoring a large part of their population. It is honestly like disturbing for the affirmative to even defend this. But next, they talk about how the poor are affected more by climate change. They bring this up in the first speech as well, and I try to POI it, yet there's literally no warrant for this argument. Why are the poor more affected by climate change? They don't provide any evidencing that the poor live like closer to the water or anything like that. Don't let them bring up new warrants or evidence in the last speech. There's no warrant for this. But now on to the third contention. They talk about, again, the third contention is just a cross-application of the California argument. They're trying to say that businesses don't move elsewhere and we don't provide any examples. I would say that let's put ourselves into the shoes of a CEO of like Exxon, for example, or the CEO of some factory. What's a logical thing to do? If it's too expensive for you to produce in America and you can produce the same things in India where it's a lot cheaper, you're going to move there. In fact, when we coalesce the two pieces of evidence about California that both sides have been reading, we're finding this is the most likely scenario that companies are simply moving out of California to other countries, which decreases the total emissions in America, but overall increases the total emissions in the world, and increases the per company emissions in California. That's the only way both studies can coexist. That's going to be super problematic because in these other countries, they don't even have the regulation that exists in America, which is going to be more problem in the environment. But now let's go on to the first contention about climate change on the affirmative. First of all, turn this, because insofar as they have conceded to our definition of greenhouse gases, we're looking at water vapor as well. That's going to be really problematic because now this emissions goes towards like nuclear power as well, which releases water vapor into the atmosphere. Water vapor is not nearly as damning. However, when we hit nuclear power, and most of the nuclear power companies are still relatively small, yet nuclear power makes up 20% of the U.S.'s energy, we're going to find that A, energy prices increase, and B, we're finding a lot of these nuclear power companies are severely hit, which is going to exacerbate all the impacts of our second contention, which is like harming energy prices for the poor. And furthermore, since nuclear power doesn't contribute to like rising global climate change in the world, we're going to find that this isn't going to be offense for them. But then they talk about how the point of no return is the 2025. Recognize that insofar as they're allowing 500 million tons of carbon emissions per year, we're going to find that we're going to reach this global tipping point far before it's like we're going to reach this global tipping point before 2025. And essentially, we're not going to have time in order to like reverse this because 2025 is too soon. There's not enough time for cap and trade to affect its impact before we reach this global tipping point. So at the point where the app has established a global tipping point where we're going to have like climate change just run away, the cap and trade simply isn't fast enough to contradict this or go against this. But then let's talk about again, you can classify the arguments that I made and talk about how we wouldn't necessarily spend the money on green energy projects. There's like no warrant for them to do so. But next, they talk about how, let's go on to the idea of how companies may circumvent this. The key idea here is that companies are going to move away. There's no warrant for why they wouldn't do so. In fact, if you put yourself in the shoes of any like CEO of a company like this, you're going to find they're going to move away. The key idea here is that with cap and trade, there is a certain threshold, a certain limit to how much you can reduce your emissions while still keeping like your profits the same. At the point where there's a limit to how much you can reduce your emissions before you just like simply go out of business, we're going to find that either A, prices go up sharply. Now they're going to say that's a good thing because of like the economic argument. However, really quick on their second contention, turn this because the moment you have these negative externalities and you try to adjust for them, you are definitionally moving away from the market equilibrium. Now this is going to be really bad for the poor because once you move away from the business market equilibrium, you are hurting some buyers who are willing to buy and hurting some sellers who are willing to sell. And the buyers who are willing to buy are the poor people who are going to be freezing at night when they don't have the energy to power their homes. So ultimately, the round boils down to the fact that they don't have any offense coming off their first contention because there's simply so many ways for the companies to circumvent this, and they don't provide how much that bar of 500 million is going to reduce each year. At the point where they don't provide that, we have to look at the current political climate, and the current political climate is actually set to increase if not decrease that bar. So for those reasons, I strongly oppose.
Alright, so 4-minute LOR. The order is just going to be an overview of the round thus far, then the 3 main vote issues for the opposition. Judges ready?
Yeah.
4 minutes, starting now. round thus far. This entire round is going to be boiling down to the issues of whether or not climate change is going to have any impact in this round, who's going to be winning it, and who's going to be winning the economic impacts, and how those impacts weigh upon one another. With that said, let's go on to one of the arguments that the government gives you. This entire argument about externalities. As my partner said beforehand, the externalities argument is not terminalized in any of the speeches whatsoever. They say that externalities is a mechanism by which they solve climate change, but it's never actually made clear how exactly this happens in the first place, which means that we should just be looking towards who wins the climate change argument overall to see who's going to be gaining access to these impacts. With that said, there are three main voting issues for the opposition in this debate. First of all, is that climate change simply has no impact whatsoever. Remember all the non-unique arguments that the opposition has given you in this round. First of all, as my partner said within the last speech, even if we do buy that the brink is at 2025, and if we don't stop emitting, and that we have to go and stop emitting before 2025 to make sure that we don't go past the point of no return, well, even if we do pass this cap and trade policy, well, then we still won't be able to go and meet that 2025 deadline, because even if you do pass in this policy, well, even if you pass in this policy, companies won't have enough time to go and find all the technology that they need to go and stop emitting altogether, and they most certainly won't be able to go and adapt their technological facilities in time, which means that they're not even meeting their own deadline. But second of all, there's no actual reason given why the brink is exactly 2025. All they do is read this number, and they never actually give you a reason as to why it's true. But third, they also, even if they do cut emissions using the cap and trade system, there's no reason as why the emissions from cars wouldn't just also push us off the brink as well. There's no actual reason as why factories and companies are the determining factor on this brink. But fourth and most importantly, it's this conceded argument coming off of the LOC that simply other countries also are emitting as well. India's emitting, China's emitting, Japan's emitting, the rest of the EU's emitting, most of Africa's emitting, Brazil's also emitting. There's absolutely no reason whatsoever as why they're going to be modeling the United States policy and actually adopting a cap and trade system as well. Even if you're solving for greenhouse emissions within the United States, there's no reason that's why you're solving for the entire rest of the world, which means that global warming still happens. They're still pushing us off of the 2025 brink, which means that there is no way that the government actually solves for climate change. Don't let them derive any impacts off of this. But second is the issue that companies will simply move overseas. Even if you buy the argument that a cap and trade system can create the difference in whether or not we go off of this brink, the fact of the matter is that companies still move overseas. Their only argument against this is that we have no specific example of a company that moved overseas as a result of the California cap and trade system. However, it's plainly logical. Even if there are benefits for staying within the United States, the fact of the matter is that all these other countries don't have to go and contend with the cap and trade system, which means that eventually international competition will mean that companies within the United States will either have to move or go out of business, which means that overall these companies will be moving towards other countries with weaker regulations, which means that they make climate change worse, not better. There's going to be more pollutants, not less. With that said, at best, the government policy keeps carbon emissions overall the same, and at worst, it's simply going to make the entire
Let's go time. Oh my god. Was it the thing over there? Yeah. That happened to us, my laptop.
Oh, really? Yeah, I think that's better.
You know what? We can move the other thing.
Yeah.
It's
Still a little
cool,
quick,
and then
right?
I'll just go over there.
That's what you call it when your panel falls over for you.
We have 1 minute left.
Just one thing, because I know everyone watched. Are the recordings back up and running?
Yeah, it's right. I didn't stop it.
56 seconds at the LOR. Resuming now. Remember that the second reason as why you ultimately vote for the opposition side is this reason that companies move overseas. At best, the government is doing nothing to stop climate change. At worst, they're simply making the entire problem even worse. But third and finally, is going to be the issue of that energy prices simply go up. They make all these arguments that hurting poor people is good, and that apparently we should be driving all these companies out of business, and how we should be losing tens of thousands of jobs. But the fact of the matter is that there is a huge human cost associated with this. There's a 50% increase in gas prices. There's going to be a 90% increase in normal house electricity prices. And all these are going to be hitting the poor the most. Even if you think that hurting the poor is good, I would doubt that anybody would think that them freezing out on the streets is any way, shape, or form a good thing. They've also conceded the fact that tens of thousands of jobs are lost. And remember, this is always going to be outlaying on probability, because there is a very little probability that their little policy will actually solve for the entire problem of global climate change, while there is a 100% chance that they will be hurting the poor, that they will cause the loss of tens of thousands of jobs. It is for these reasons that I urge an opposition ballot. It is important, regardless of whether or not you are left or right, it is important that we do what is right before no one is left.
Overview of the round, and I'll be talking about like some issues of clash, then I'll be going to the first contention. Three, two, one. The problem with the negations case today, they have no viable alternative to solve for climate change. It is literally try or die for the affirmative here, because they agree with us. We both agree that climate change is a pressing problem, but who has a chance of solving? They concede evidence that the United States is doing zilch right now in the status quo to solve for climate change, which means if we pass this plan, there's only a risk that we solve for climate change. Here's how we're rating this round. We're rating this round under net benefit. If we save even one person from the harms of climate change, that is greater than what they're doing, because they're doing nothing. They're advocating for the status quo. This is how you frame this round, that all their arguments to our case are defensive. Oh, it might not work this way, or it might not do this one. But there's even a risk that we solve for one person. That is enough to vote affirmative. So let's go over some main points of contention of clash. First of all, they talk about how big companies, they won't move overseas. It's empirically disproven. Maya gives you tons of reasons why they like the United States and why the regulation in climate and the economy is perfect from the United States. They never did move overseas. There's no thing. There's no work doing it. They can't name one. Wait.
The argument that companies like uniquely like the U.S. just because they like the U.S. is new.
So I said in my speech that it's a very desirable place to live, both in terms of regulations and in terms of the fact that we have good food and good culture. So yeah. Let's continue on.
They completely concede this argument, which means there's only a risk that big companies won't move, and it doesn't make sense to move. What instead will happen is that they'll transition. That's what our link argument on, of course, climate change is, that they'll be forced to transition to other sources because of the cost. They never deal with any of this analysis, specifically saying that if you make fossil fuels more expensive, they'll have to transition to the renewable sources. The reason people don't use renewables right now is because they're slightly more expensive than fossil fuels. But if we increase the trials of fossil fuels, we transition, we're strengthening the renewable industry. They completely drop this, which is at the point at which we're strengthening the renewable resources energy. That means that we're winning. Next off, about poor people. We are not saying we're harming poor people, but we're saying for the poor people, climate change is a bigger threat than this. We're saying that if we return this, they can transition over to renewable energy, they can transition to clean source of power and not use something that will literally kill them. We terminalized this in the first speech. We said poor people are directly harmed by climate change, specifically due to the fact that they have the least amount of resources to move out of affected areas. This is clear from the first speech, showing that poor people are directly harmed by climate change. So it's only a risk that we can help fix them. Next, they talk about like Trump would intervene. No, we have durable fiat. We will pass the plan. We clearly delineated in the first speech that Trump can't intervene. It has clear set conditions. We're modeling it after the California plan. There's no risk here. Now, one more thing. They bring up that water vapor and some ridiculous point about nuclear energy. Water vapor is H2O, greenhouse gases and carbon. And that literally doesn't make sense. Water vapor is not considered a greenhouse gas by any extent to any imagination. We're not talking about it. Also, our plan clearly lays out what's happening. Sorry.
They never challenged our definition that greenhouse gas is anything that absorbs in representation before.
I never heard the word water vapor until the MO, which means I get to respond to it in the PMR.
Well, also, he talked a ton about it. He may have said it like once in the first speech, but he capitalized on it, so we get to respond to it in our last speech because they just brought it up in the block.
We included water vapor.
No back and forth. We'll take it into consideration.
Okay. 3, 2, 1. Now let's quickly go to the negative externalities part. Now they mishandle this point. Here's why. This is a root cause claim, saying that this is the only way to fix climate change is by addressing this argument. Specifically, we say that the negative externality of fossil fuels emission is the root cause of climate change. Is conceded. Climate change is the biggest impact on the environment. We're the only team to solve the root cause, specifically because
this negative externality is impacting the market price. The market price, we are not seeing it right now because of the
we're
negative
not seeing the market price of climate change. We're not actually seeing how much it's affecting us, but we're causing the price to go up. We're forcing companies to actually pay for what it's costing the environment, which causes it to go down in the first place. Okay, now straight to the climate change advantage. Okay. We're going to do some extending arguments. This is uniquely key. One, extend the fact that climate change is an imminent threat. We both agree that climate change is an imminent threat to our future. Second, extend the fact that the U.S. has shown an inaction in climate change. That means we're doing nothing right now to solve for climate change. All this goes completely conceded. Also, extend the example that the United States is a huge polluter and emits a lot of emissions. Yes, we won't be able to solve for all emissions, but we can make a start. This is a start. I got this. We can make a start, which is really important. Now on to the links. Here's a crucial link. The problem is they never deal with any of our links about perception and signaling. We specifically tell you that this is just a start, that when we do this, we're signaling a change in climate policy. We're moving away from saying, no, we don't care about the environment, to say we're actually taking the first step. This is specific evidence from the California Environmental Foundation that goes 100% conceded, which means we are the start, we are the jumping off point to future initiatives which can actually solve for climate change in the first place. On the impact, they read these arguments that climate change is not unique, but we specifically say that we can fix it. If we try, we have to do something to try to fix this. Like there's only a risk that we can solve for. Because at the end of the day, here's how this round breaks out. We both agree climate change is a threat. We have a way to solve it. They have nothing. They're advocating for a world in the status quo where climate change, where the United States does zilch to fight climate change. Yes, our plan is not perfect. We do not pretend that it's perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than the status quo. In the status quo, we are doing nothing. There's only a risk that we can solve for climate change. Like, think about all their arguments of defense, that they'll move overseas or something, or that it'll directly harm poor people. We've clearly shown you that the biggest impact in this round is climate change. Because remember, climate change affects the most amount of people and will cause the most amount of harm to the most amount of people.
See the root cause.
And we can see the root cause of this negative externality. So at the end of the day, it's still worth it to cut emissions, even if we can't solve for all of climate change. If we can even delay it for a year, that's millions of people's lives we're saving for that 1 year. So if we're delaying it for that 1 year under net benefits, we are still winning. So here's how this round, let's just give a quick final overview. They bring up a lot of defense arguments. If you evaluate their case, look at them. They're all defensive arguments for why our plan might not work the way it's supposed to. So that means, at the end of the day, way of the world, we are doing something. If we can even solve one life from climate change, that is better than the status quo, which is what they're advocating for. Thank you.